It resembles a standard laptop but has two screens. One is 16 inches and the other is 14 inches. This machine is powered by a 6-core, 12-thread Intel processor and comes with either 7 or 16 gigabytes of RAM, and it has a 1 terabyte SSD on board. Even the battery is bigger than you might expect. On top of that, the laptop looks really cool, and the manufacturer designed it so that even an amateur can easily add a second SSD or extra RAM just by unscrewing this one plastic cover. But that's not all, because on the back there's an Oculink port, which lets you connect an external enclosure for a powerful desktop graphics card to this laptop. And what if I told you that at the time of making this video, this laptop with all its features costs 2,939 zlotys? Shocked? I definitely am. That's why I invite you to watch the whole video, because it's really worth it. This is Pavel, and you're watching TechManiacHD. A very simple cardboard box, thick bubble wrap, a sleeve, and we already have the new laptop in our hands. It looks very sleek, and the grey metallic finish is really appealing. The laptop is mostly made of aluminum alloy, with only the bottom part made of plastic, but color-wise it's almost indistinguishable. On the right there are two 5GB USB Type-A ports, a combo mini jack, a gigabit 45 socket, and something that should be a power indicator LED, but in reality that's actually on the left side of the laptop. But let's move on. Right next to it, there's an HDMI 2.0 port, another 5GB USB Type-A port, and a USB Type-C port with the same bandwidth, which also supports DisplayPort Out mode. This means you can connect another display to it. My monitor, with a resolution of 1440p, worked without any problems, although the refresh rate is limited to 165 Hz here. On the back, there's an Oculink port, which can be used, for example, to connect an external graphics card. When you open the lid, you'll be pleasantly surprised. You don't have to hold down the bottom part of the laptop, it doesn't lift up at all. Beautiful balance. I assume that it's the design and the placement of the second screen here that stirs up the most excitement, so let's stick with this topic for a moment. It may seem strange and surprising, but I think everyone will agree that it's an interesting solution, and to all the skeptics, I have to say right away that there's nothing to be afraid of or to resist. The screen is solid. I can lift the entire laptop and swing it from side to side, holding only this additional 14-inch screen. Nothing creaks, nothing cracks. Some of you might also be concerned about the placement of the keyboard, but honestly, my friends, there's nothing to worry about, and when using it on a desk, it doesn't make the slightest difference. And I'm not saying this as someone who's really hyped about gear and will accept anything. Oh no, not at all. I've used this Asus solution for a year and a half, so I have experience. I'm referring to the Zephyrus Duo 16, valued at 15,000 zlotys, on which I've already worked thousands of hours. That's why I think it's hard to find a better person for this review, because my point of reference will be Asus's top model. But even having these two devices side by side and looking at how they're built, you'd never say that one could be 5 times cheaper than the other. The idea is the same, even the build quality isn't particularly different. Asus is also made half out of aluminum with plastic on the bottom. The hinges are a bit different, which makes the screen lift angle on the Endbook slightly lower, but which solution is better or worse, well, who knows. I also have to mention that the display used here is most likely exactly the same one you'll find in the Asus ZenBook Pro Duo or the Zephyrus Duo 16. In my Asus, I have a 1080p screen, but this one here is 4K. You'll find the same one in the more expensive variant of the Zephyrus Duo for 25,000 zlotys. This screen features a 3840x1100 resolution, 300 nits brightness, and 100% sRGB color coverage. You might say someone really lost their mind here. This is supposed to be a cheap laptop, but they've used an absolutely top-tier screen. The only reasonable explanation for choosing a premium segment panel is probably that there was nothing else available in a 32:9 ratio. My Zephyrus Duo with a 1080p screen is a model from 2022, and apparently they probably don't make those anymore. On AliExpress, you can get a similar panel with the same resolution as an external monitor, but it costs around 600 zlotys. Some of you probably already know exactly what you would use this screen for. Most viewers are likely still wondering what this contraption is and why you need it. On the Zephyrus, I got used to keeping two messengers there that I use most often, On the tested MBook Fly, due to the 4K resolution, I also keep a third additional window here. The high level of detail even at the default 150% scaling ensures excellent readability. Of course, if we want, we can increase the scaling to 175%, where everything will be bigger, but we can also decrease the scaling to 125 or even 100%. We'll fit more on the screen that way, but in my opinion, everything becomes too small. Websites are hard to read on this smaller screen, but if you're transcribing text or some longer code that can't be copied, it's a great solution. Sometimes I watch things like that on YouTube. Of course, there are those borders on the sides, but since we mainly focus on what's on the upper screen anyway, it doesn't really bother me. On the other hand, when playing a game, you can put a hardware load monitor or messengers there, and if the game is rather relaxing, maybe even a movie. The very fact that it's a touchscreen helps a lot here, because you don't have to mess around with switching apps while you're in a game, you just need to touch it. If you've seen the review of the almost identical design from Krellender, you know that the 16-inch panel used there was absolutely terrible. I don't have that device for comparison, but the serial number shows this panel is completely different. It may not be the best in the world, but 97% sRGB coverage is more than enough for most tasks. This is a 1200p screen, meaning its resolution is 1920 by 1200 pixels, making it taller than a standard 1080p screen. Thanks to this, the bezels at the top and bottom are much smaller than on an average 16:9 laptop. The maximum brightness of the main screen is 300 nits, so it's not ideal for working in full sunlight, but it's more than enough for home or office use. I typically use the 5th or sometimes 6th level out of 23. Both screens have different color reproduction, which can be bothersome in certain situations. The bottom screen is also definitely cooler, while the main one leans more toward warm tones. The larger screen has good viewing angles. The bottom one, on the other hand, loses a lot of brightness when you look at it from below, but during normal use, it really isn't a problem. Although I personally really don't like using a laptop that lies flat on the desk. To improve ergonomics, I've attached these little feet to every laptop for years. The cost is negligible, just a few to a dozen zlotys, but it greatly increases comfort. Although the lower screen is already at a 12-degree angle, it's still not enough. With the feet, we'll raise it by at least that much again. If you want to check it out, I'll also include a link to those feet in the description. But let's get back to the topic and talk about the technical specifications. Once again, I have to emphasize that this is a laptop with a 16-inch screen and a second 14-inch one, and its dimensions are no different from an average laptop with a 15.6-inch screen. The weight could be better, but this is a 2.5 kilogram device that has tremendous potential for multitasking. On board, there's a 6-core, 12-thread Intel i7-10850H, which theoretically boosts up to 5.1 GHz. After unscrewing 2 screws at the bottom of the laptop, we get full access to the RAM and drives. I like the fact that the manufacturer equipped the device with a single 16 GB memory module. Of course, it's much better to have 2 modules, because then they will work in dual-channel mode, but if they filled both slots with 2 8 GB modules, upgrading would be more difficult. Just add another 16 GB module and you'll be set for years. But will such a cheap laptop really support 32 GB of RAM? Well, it's worth checking. For this purpose, I asked Kingston to send me the appropriate memory for testing, and everything is perfectly fine. The memory sticks are detected correctly, and together with the originally pre-installed one, they work in dual-channel mode, and their speed is 2666 megatransfers per second. Buying faster ones is likely pointless since I didn't see an extreme memory profile option in the basic input-output system, making it an unnecessary expense. I'll also leave a link to the appropriate modules in the description. As you can see right next to it, there's a 1TB SSD from a brand I've never heard of. It works properly and will be more than enough for the vast majority of users, but this laptop is capable of much more. That's why once again, Kingston comes to the rescue, allowing me to check whether a drive with such a huge capacity as 4 TB would even work in such an inexpensive device. And my dear friends, yes, the drive is recognized perfectly fine. However, when I installed it in the free M2 slot, it wasn't recognized. Apparently, that one doesn't support Peripheral Component Interconnect Express, only Serial Advanced Technology attachment. That's why I replaced the pre-installed drive with a Kingston one, and now everything works perfectly. I've already made a dedicated video about the KC3000 model, and I definitely encourage you to check it out. With the right hardware, it reads and writes at speeds exceeding 7,000 megabytes per second, but the Intel 10th generation processor installed here didn't support Peripheral Component Interconnect Express 4.0 yet. That's why we're limited to 3.5 gigabytes per second. But I think everyone will agree that it's still much better than the barely 600 megabytes that the pre-installed drive here can reach at most. Today, such a drive costs about 1,600 zlotys. Although the 2 terabyte version is more cost-effective, I doubt anyone would go for such an upgrade right now. I just wanted to check whether this laptop won't end up in the trash in a few years when we start running out of RAM or disk space. I'll also tell you that before the Zephyrus Duo 16, I bought the ZenBook Pro Duo. Unfortunately, this laptop, which cost over £2,500 at the time, had only one slot for a drive, and it didn't even support a 4 terabyte drive. That was really disappointing, and that's why I returned it to the store and got all my money back. And here, look, a cheap Chinese laptop, and yet it can put even the biggest ones to shame. Alright, and since we already know that we can be more productive on this laptop than on one with just a single screen, and upgrading it isn't a problem, the next important aspect we should discuss is the keyboard. I sugarcoated it, saying the device is surprisingly amazing. Now it's time for the unpleasant part, because the keyboard is an absolute work of the devil. At least that's the impression you get during the first few days of using it. I mean, when it comes to how the buttons press, it's not bad. Nothing spectacular, but fully usable. I've typed dozens of pages on this keyboard and I'm still alive. It also has white backlighting. It's not perfect and you can see where the LEDs are, but it's better than nothing. However, someone must have been really confused to put the power button where the backspace should be, and to replace the right shift key with the delete button. Luckily, you have to hold it down for a good 3 seconds to activate it. But come on, that's just unbelievable stupidity, but that's not all. Getting certain characters, like the vertical bar symbol, is really unintuitive. Honestly, for a while, I had a real problem just trying to type that symbol at all. I managed to figure out that you need to hold FN with Shift. Honestly, it's no problem once you know about it, but if you don't, then yeah, it is a problem. But it's nice that the multimedia buttons work. My Zephyrus lacks those features, and I always have music playing in the background. As for the touchpad, it's not the best one I've ever worked with, but it does its job. The movement isn't lost, the cursor doesn't jump, and the precision itself is perfectly fine. 3 and 4 finger gestures also work as they should. Before I bought my Zephyrus, one thing kept bothering me, and no one on YouTube answered my question. How does it feel to use this laptop on your lap? More importantly, how does it work on a small foldable table? I often use one at home. Because of the keyboard being pushed far forward, honestly, using a dual-screen laptop on your lap is a bit less comfortable. It's possible, but it's definitely not very comfortable. However, on a small table, the big problem is the bottom of the keyboard, which rests on the support, but there's a way around that too. Just unfold the legs I mentioned earlier, and the situation changes dramatically. We attach the laptop to the legs, improving ergonomics and giving space to rest your wrists while typing. I've used this little table for years, and I can add a link in the description if you want. For that kind of money, I expected really poor speakers, but surprisingly, it's not that bad at all. They're quite loud, but definitely not terrible. They work quite well for watching something on YouTube or for background music while working. As you can see and hear, the built-in camera and microphone aren't great. However, for a regular video call, at least in my opinion, it's more than enough. What bothers me more than the camera quality is the fact that there's no indicator light to let us know when it's active. The processor, as well as the other components, consume small amounts of energy, but in this device, it's the screen, or actually these two screens, that use up the most. Despite this, with standard use like browsing and messaging, the 51 watt-hours are enough for 3 to 3.5 hours of use with comfortable brightness, Wi-Fi connection, and active Bluetooth. I know, it's nothing spectacular, but you can't say it's a bad result for a dual-screen device either. My Zephyrus Duo 16 lasts up to 3 hours at most. But just to verify, I played a YouTube clip in full screen at 1080p resolution with the sound set to 40% volume and unplugged the power. On the lower screen, I placed a performance monitor, a browser tab showing the current time and the current battery charge level. In this mode, the laptop lasted for 2 hours and 36 minutes. Charging is definitely not the fastest here. It takes a little over 3 hours to fully recharge the battery. The included 90-watt power adapter, at least for this power, is not small at all. Together with all the cables, it also weighs about half a kilogram. Let's finally talk about the performance itself, and this is the aspect that surprised me the most during testing. Unfortunately, it was a negative surprise because on paper, the Intel i7-10850H processor looks quite good, and having it in such a budget-friendly build is extremely pleasing. It may not be the newest after all, it's the 10th generation, but 6 cores and 12 threads still get the job done, especially since the clock speeds for single-core tasks can be boosted up to 5.1 GHz, and for multi-threaded tasks, which fully load the processor, those speeds can go up to 4.4 GHz. Of course, that's only in systems that provide sufficiently efficient cooling. Thus, according to the ranking in Cinebench R23, we should see between 7,400 and 7,500 points, but we have just under 5,400, which equals a 28% drop. The situation is worse in single-core tasks, with just over 700 points instead of about 1,200, a result 40% below expectations. Why is this happening? Well, as it turns out, the manufacturer has locked the processor at its base clocks, which are 2.7 GHz. However, I was quietly hoping that I could overcome something using the Intel Extreme Tuning utility program. The official tool clearly says that it's not possible, and even though I tried different combinations in advanced tuning, none of the changes were taken into account anyway. On the other hand, throttle stop lets you uncheck the locked turbo option, and without any load the clocks actually jump to over 4 GHz in some places, but in reality, it doesn't change anything. As soon as you put it under load, all the clocks immediately drop to 2.7 GHz. Opening the limit window shows the reason is voltage regulator thermal, indicating the voltage regulators are overheating. So I tried to improve the cooling of the power section using small heat sinks. I used special double-sided thermal tape here and stuck them onto the MOSFETs and VRMs. I only had 14 of the smallest ones, and the larger heat sinks wouldn't fit anywhere, so I wasn't able to cover everything. The cover sticks out a little when closed, but if it helps, it's probably worth it, right? Well, it's not worth it at all, because the result is basically nothing. The clocks are still being reduced to the base values, which makes me think that such small heat sinks are simply not enough. However, I still didn't want to give up, so I took off the cover, put it on a cooling pad, and as it turned out, the processor clocks were only in boost for a moment at first, then just like before, they dropped back to the base values. So we get essentially the same result as before. It's possible that if you covered the entire section with heat sinks and permanently left the cover open, combined with a more efficient cooling pad, it could be better, but in my opinion, it's not worth the trouble. Alright, so what is this port located at the back? This is Oculink, mainly popular in server applications, but in this case, it can be used to connect an external graphics card. The simplest method is to buy a ready-made solution, such as the GDP-G1. The performance of the Radeon 7600 MXT inside is more than enough for our laptop. It's a good solution, but it's also expensive, over $700. A much more interesting solution is to buy something like this for 50 zlotys. The set includes a docking station, an Oculink cable, and a cable that you connect from the power supply directly to the graphics card. Of course, you need that too, but if you have an older GTX, it would be perfect for this. You can find the current price of this set right below the link to this laptop, of course, in the description. Without an external graphics card, we probably won't be able to play natively on this laptop. The integrated Intel chip only allows you to work with emails, and maybe play something like Age of Empires II on the lowest settings. Stronghold works too, but I think you know what I'm trying to say. Playing on services like GeForce Now is getting more popular. If we have a good internet connection and we're not interested in fast dynamic games, but rather something more relaxing, then we can definitely play comfortably. Overall, the situation with this laptop is, at least for me, very strange, because when you take off the bottom cover, you can see that the cooling system was designed with ambition and doesn't really fall short of the solutions known from gaming laptops. Here we have two fairly thick heat pipes carrying heat to two separate radiators, which are cooled by large, efficient fans. In theory, this laptop could be a real powerhouse. The problem is that we have a definitely too weak power section on the motherboard here, which doesn't allow the processor to reach its potential. However, since there's already so much expensive copper on the processor, it would be enough to just extend it so that it also covers and dissipates heat from the power section. This way, the laptop would become 30 to 40% more efficient. It's a shame that such potential was wasted here. In weaker laptops, a single heat pipe and one fan are used, and such a configuration would be more than enough here. Although the advantage of this solution is that the device operates really quietly, both fans keep this processor in check without the slightest effort, and I doubt that under full load, their speed exceeds 30 or 35%. This laptop has a lot of advantages, but there are also a few drawbacks. However, take them with a grain of salt, always keeping in mind the low price and what it still offers. You already know about the strange keyboard and the unimpressive processor performance, but there are still a few minor things I have to point out here. Different panel resolutions directly affect cursor position when switching screens. In my Zephyrus, both screens have the same number of horizontal pixels, so when I drag the cursor up or down, it's exactly the same distance from the side edges. However, when dragging the mouse between the screens of the tested device, the cursor ends up in a different place than you might expect. But like I said, it's a minor thing, and after a few days we stop paying much attention to it. However, this issue is not limited to the tested device only. It just so happened that during the repair period of my Zephyrus Duo 16, I borrowed another more powerful one with a 4K screen, and the situation was exactly the same. I'm also annoyed by the fact that it's impossible to reduce the brightness of the lower screen. You also can't turn it off completely, and that would significantly extend the battery life. On the Zephyrus, I have a dedicated key for that. Just tap it, and the laptop's power use drops from about 25 to 17 watts. There's no such option on the keyboard of the tested device, and on the manufacturer's website, well, I don't see any dedicated software either. It's also a shame that the laptop doesn't support charging via USB-C, and nowadays carrying a power adapter around seems kind of silly and super annoying. A few years ago, I bought this 100-watt power adapter that supports the power delivery standard. 3 USB Type-C ports and 1 USB-A port mean I can quickly charge many of my devices at the same time, including the aforementioned dual-screen gaming laptop from Asus. This power adapter also has interchangeable plugs, which makes it a super convenient option for traveling. Such a small device is enough for the whole family, but since the tested laptop doesn't support USB-C charging, I still have to bring the power adapter when I travel. In theory, yes, but I bought a special adapter on AliExpress that lets me charge the N-Book via USB-C as well, and that's how I solved that problem. I'll also leave a link to my power adapter and to that kind of tip in the description. The last drawback is that the system comes pre-installed without the Polish language. From the Microsoft Store, we can easily install the localization pack for Polish, but even then, not everything will be perfectly translated. But since the system is activated and legal, if we want, we can reinstall a fresh version of Windows 11 Pro in Polish at no additional cost. Find the relevant guide on my website www.techmaniachd.pl. One thing's for sure, you won't get such an interesting laptop for so little money. This one was shipped to me from Europe and arrived just a few days after ordering. You will also find a link to the kickbuying.pl store, where you get a warranty with the option to return in the description.